Okay, Rabbi Moshe, this week we're going to be discussing Chalav Akum, the heter of drinking milk of the goyim. Is there a heter of Chalav Yisroel? Does it apply nowadays? Are we working with Reb Moshe? What's going on? Tell me from the start, from the beginning, what is the deal? So here we go, guys. Let's do it. There's a Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, Daf Lamed Hey Beis, that says these are of the things that are asur to eat, but they aren't asur b'hana. And the first on the list is milk that was milked by a guy, and the Jew didn't see it. So it was milked by a guy, but there wasn't a Jew to save the day and see it. And that is asur to drink. Zach the Gemara, a couple points I want to bring from the Gemara. One point is the Gemara asks, wait a second, why don't you just, what are we concerned about? Were you concerned about that you're going to switch and do non-Jewish milk in the place of Jewish milk? Just one side point, what is non-Jewish milk? Why is milk not kosher? What type of milk's not kosher? Milks don't need split hooves. So the idea is there's a Mishnah in Bechiris that says, based on the pasuk, anything that comes out of a kol sheyotzeh min tamei tamehu, anything that comes out of something tamei is not kosher itself. So therefore, if you have milk that comes from a camel or milk that comes from a horse, for example, those milks are not going to be kosher. But if you have milk that comes from a cow, a sheep, a goat, then it is going to be kosher. Okay. So what are you worried about this whole Chalav Yisroel thing? You're worried that the milk's going to come from a non-kosher animal? You can look at it and see, apparently, the Gemara says, that the tamei milk is green, whereas the kosher milk is white. Now, not that I've actually checked out much tamei milk, but I don't think it's mamish green. I imagine it means that it has a greenish tinge to it, is what I assume it means. Once again, I can't tell you I checked into it, but that's what I assume. So you could see by the tinge, you could see by the color that it's not kosher milk. What are you worried about? The Gemara answers, we're worried that you're going to mix in some of this milk. And I want to just do a spoiler for a second. I grew up learning, you were worried that it's pig's milk. It seems to be that there is no commercial market for pig's milk. It's not something that anybody is really selling. There's not much pig's milk. It's very difficult to try to find pig's milk. Pigs don't like getting milked. The milks that you could find, which aren't kosher, are camel milk, horse milk, mule milk. But you will not really find any pig's milk. Is it theoretically possible? Yes. But I don't know if it... Definitely nowadays it's not a practical thing on the market, and I don't think it ever was. Okay, so we're worried maybe they're going to mix in this tamei milk. So Gemara has a suggestion. Why don't you just go and take this milk and use it, turn it into cheese? And if you turn it into cheese, then you'll know that it is kosher. Why will you know it is kosher? Well, you will know it's kosher because apparently the tamei milk does not turn into cheese. Only kosher milk could turn into cheese. And if only kosher milk turns into cheese, once you turn it into cheese, great! So the Gemara answers, the first answer of the Gemara at least, Hakanami, yes! For what I want to use as cheese, that will work. But what if I want a good glass of milk? Or I want to use it for kutach, I don't know, some milk dip, then I will not know. And there's a second answer that even the cheese might have some, in the holes, there might be some liquid that didn't turn into cheese, and that liquid might be from a behemoth tamei. Okay, one thing seems to be clear from these two answers, that if the milk would turn into cheese, that would work to tell me, and there was no Hashash of the behemoth tamei milk being inside these holes, meaning if I would be able to do a scientific experiment, and that scientific experiment would tell me that the milk is not tamei, then that milk would be good for use. Okay, I want to quote another Gemara. There's another Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Lametes Amid Beis, which discusses that when a Yisrael is watching the Goyish milk, then that milk is allowed to be used, eaten, drinking. What does it mean that Yisrael watches? Ra'uhu. Watches them, actually. By the way, it's interesting to note, I believe from the diktuk, it doesn't mean that it watches necessarily the milk. I think it watches the Ovid Chachavim, which is plural. It's watching the Goyim do the milking. We'll see in a minute if there's any significance in that little dik. So, we have a Yisrael watching. What type of watching? Does he have to watch that it goes into the bucket? Absolutely. What does he have to watch? So the Gemara says that if a Jew is sitting and from his sitting position he cannot see that there is no chalav tameah being mixed in, but if he would merely stand up, he would be able to see that there is no chalav Akum being mixed in. He is allowed to drink that milk that the goy brings him, because the goy is surely afraid to mix in any not kosher milk, because the Jew's going to see. Look, the Jew's going to see. He's sitting down. All he has to do is stand up to take a peek. There's no way the guy is going to play a game. He's mirsus. He's certainly afraid. And since there's mirsus, that he's certainly afraid, therefore that milk is considered that the Jew is watching, even though he didn't see the milk actually go into the pail. There's discussion in the Gemara we're referring to specifically if there's no non-kosher animals around, or is it even when there are kosher animals around? So the Gemara says it's pashid that this would work if there is non-kosher animals around. If there's no non-kosher, if it's only cows around, it's pashid that this would work. It's unclear. Is it pashid that you don't even need somebody watching, or is it pashid that the mirsus, the sitting down Jew, is enough? So there's two different ways of learning what it means when the Gemara says pshita. But the Gemara continues and says we're talking about even if there is non-Jewish, non-kosher animals around, but if all the Jew has to do is stand up, there's going to be mirsus, the guy's going to be afraid, and we could rely on that Jew. The Shach and Taz both bring down that not only does the Jew sitting count, but Yoitze v'nichnatz counts as well. So that means if the Jew is coming in and out, that will be enough to create a scenario of mirsus where the guy is afraid to mix in the behemoth tameah milk, and that would be allowed. How often the Jew needs to come in to create this mirsus is somewhat unclear. You know, if he's coming in once every 6 months, doesn't sound to me like that's going to create a major fright. But if he comes, how often exactly, that is not clear. Okay. So we see once again, you do not have to actually see the milk going into the bucket, but just the Jew being there in the sitting position is enough. The Ramah says further, there's a din lechatchila, that the Jew needs to see that the bucket, or nowadays the vat where you are milking in, has to be empty before the start. So he has to be there at tchilas chaliva, the initial starting point of the milking. The Shach says that's not a din lechatchila like the Ramah, rather even b'diavad, that's an absolute requirement. The Ramah says that's what you should do, that's the best to do. If you didn't do it, it's still kosher. Zak the Shach, you have to do it. And if you don't do it, the milk is traif, it is aser mitam chalav akum. Okay, let me ask you a question. From the evidence that we have in front of us, what is this din of chalav akum? There's two possibilities. Is it a hashash? There's a hashash, there's a possibility that chalav akum could be chalav tameah. and therefore, or at least could have had Chalav Tameh mixed in. And Chazal are telling us, even though from pure dinim, you wouldn't have to be choishish for that Hashash, but we are going to tell you midarabanan, you have to be choishish for that Hashash. Meaning, midaraisa, you can rely on Raiv. Raiv milk, we know, is cow's milk. It always was, and everywhere that I'm familiar with, Raiv the milk around was always cow's milk. And called a parish, miruba parish. Any milk that comes away from the general milk supply, we assume it comes from the majority. And if the majority is cow milk, it's cow milk. Oh, is it possible that there is some camel milk around? Yes, it's possible. But midaraisa achi rabim lahata is called the parish, miruba parish. We're allowed to rely on the raiv, and midaraisa, that's okay. Comes along the rabbanan and says, no, maybe saying Torah, you have to be choshish that non-Jewish milk is the behemoth tameh, even though midrasa you seemingly wouldn't have to be choshish. Okay, so that's one possibility. And the other possibility is it's a Gezeirah. Just like we have Gezeirahs on Pasakum, on Bishul Akum, which have all sorts of reasons, Mishum Chasanais, because to prevent intermarriage. So too over here, it's a Gezeirah. You are not allowed to have Chalav Akum. Now it's true, this Gezeirah is not necessarily the Iker reason, has nothing to do with intermarriage, and seemingly that's not the reason as far as we know, but the reason might be based on maybe the guy is going to mix in this Chalav Tameh, this not kosher milk. However, perhaps it was done in the form of a Gezeirah. What is it? Is it a Hashash or is it a Gezeirah? What is the nafkamina? Well, the nafkamina is tremendous. The nafkamina is, if it's a Hashash, well, we enlarge the Hashash. But if there's no reason to be chayshish, then the Isser of Chalav Akum doesn't apply. But if it's a Gezeirah, I don't care if the reason for the Hashash doesn't apply. I don't care if I have no reason to be chayshish. Chazal were Geyser Gezeirah, that Gezeirah is applicable whether or not the reason is here. You want to go against the Gezeirah of Chazal? You need to be greater in Chachma Minyan. You have to have a larger size Bezdin that is wiser to be Mevatel the Gezeirah. And that is certainly not happening. So which one is it? Is it a Hashash Ba'alma or is it a Gezeirah? So this is not a new discussion. This was discussed way before Reb Moshe. And there's lots of names that we could throw on both sides. I would say we'll say that the tzad, that it's just a Hashash, the Radbaz says it. And the Pri Chodesh and the Tashbit says it also. And the Pri Chodesh says we pass them like this Radbaz. And this we pass like this Radbaz, it's just a Hashash. And if there's no reason to be chayshish, because then to hate, you would be allowed to have the guy's milk. What would be the case of no reason to be chayshish? If you're living in a society that doesn't milk horses and doesn't milk camels, or there's no camels around. So if you live in such a society, memela, there's no reason to be chayshish, and therefore it would be allowed. Or maybe, this is a little bit more debatable, if the cost of the behemoth tameh milk is way more than the cost of the regular cow's milk, so there's zero incentive for somebody to mix in the tameh milk, and we're generally not choshish that the guy is going to do it to try to get us to do Yisurim. We're generally not choshish for that. Memela, there's no reason to be chayshish, and therefore it would be allowed. However, once again, if it's a Gezeirah, it's a Gezeirah, and you can't have that milk. So once again, the Tashbitz, the Radbaz, and the Pre-Chodesh says we pass like this Radbaz, that it's just a Hashash. However, the Aruch HaShulchan and the Chachmas Adam and almost everybody else says we do not rely on the Radbaz. And as the Shach says, that even if it were true that the halacha in theory would follow the Radbaz, that we treat it as a Hashash. However, it has been the Bnei Ashkenaz have taken it upon themselves that we do not, like a neder, that we do not have this Chalav of Akum. So if you're going to be mekel, like the Radbaz, that the halacha follows the Radbaz, it works out as a chumrah, because now you're no longer dealing with the Rabbanon of Chalav Akum, but rather you're dealing with the deraisa of a neder. So if you want to be mekel to say the halacha follows the Radbaz, it works out to be a chumrah of neder. Or you can be machmir to say it follows the Radbaz, the machmir to say that it follows the other poskim like the Aruch HaShulchan and the Chachmas Adam, for example, and therefore then it will be the Issur D'Rabbanan of Chalav Akum. The Maisa, throughout the ages, the poskim for the most part have followed the tzad that it was Asher. There was always the Yechidei Hadar that paskined that, like the Radbaz Shita, that it was allowed. Perhaps the reason why we bring down the Bnei Ashkenaz, that there was on the Sfaradim, there was a big tzad, the Chut HaMeshulish, which was three of the big father, son, grandson of the Gedolei Peiskei Sfard, who were Mekel. But I think even amongst the Sfardim, the general psak was to be Machmer, and we never had Chalav Akum, even if there was reason that the Hashash didn't apply. So you may be wondering, which is a very, before we even get into the modern day, what is the mashmois of the Gemara? What do we see from the Gemara? So on one hand, the mashmois is, remember I told you that if it's cheese, could turn into cheese, and that was a valid scientific test, everybody would rely on it. Now, if you learn Hashash, that makes perfect sense. If you know that this milk could turn into cheese, it's only made from cow's milk, then of course you could eat it, because it's a Hashash. If you know it's cow's milk, there's no reason for Hashash. But the shitas that learn, it's a takana, it's a Gezeirah. You cannot have Chalav Akum. Who cares that it could turn into cow's milk? There's a Gezeirah on it. So you would have to explain, Lefi, those shitas that learn that it's a Gezeirah, they're going to say that the Gezeirahs was only said when there's at least a possibility of suffix. There's a matzav of suffix. There's a possibility of behemoth tameah. But when we know for Yediyah Brura, it's clear for us that it's certainly from a cow, the Gezeirah was never said in such a situation. What about the case that when we said that the Jew was sitting outside of the farm, we know outside of the flock, or whatever you call those groups of animals, and all he had to do was stand up, we say that's okay. Even though he didn't stand up and he didn't see the milking, we say it's still okay. Or the Shachan Taz Yoitz V'Nichnas is okay. Why? You need the Jew to see it. So if you learn Hashash, I understand, we're not Chayshish. We're not choishish that the guy would be brazen enough to do it, to switch it, if the Jew could just see. But if you're going to learn, the pshat is, it's a understanding of there's a Gezeirah. If the Jew didn't see, it's Asher. So the Jew didn't see. Yes, he was sitting right outside the farm. He could have just stood up, but he didn't stand up. Surely it should be Asher. So those shitas will explain the Gemara. That fear that is bestowed upon the Goyish milker when the Jew is sitting by the farm, that is the Re'iyas Yisrael. That is the Jew seeing. That's what we're talking about, because as I said, it was mashma, the Jew needs to see the Goyim. The presence of the Jew needs to be upon the Goyim. And if the presence of the Jew needs to be upon the Goyim, that is the heter of Yisrael Raya. So yes, it is milk that is milked by the Goy. However, that is a way of the Jew seeing. His fear factor is the presence of the Jew, and Memela, it is okay. Okay, so we saw two factors which have the greater mashvais in the Gemara, that is just the Hashash. Why would the Shitas choose to say that it is a Gezeirah? Well, if you look at the Mishnah on Lamed Hey and Aleph says these are the things that are Asher in eating, and these are the things that are Asher in eating, but Mutter Ba'ana. And it lists Chalav, it lists Pas Akum, and it lists Shemen Akum. I know you never heard of Shemen Akum. You'll hear why in a second. And then the Mishnah goes on to say that Rebbe and his Bezdin ended up being Mater Shemen Akum. So it sounds like it was a Gezeirah, just like Pas Akum was a Gezeirah. And Shemen Akum apparently was a Gezeirah that ended up having Rebbe and his Bezdin being Mater. So it sounds like we're in the world of Gezeirah. The whole group of the Mishnah, the whole discussion, and in fact, really, the whole parak in Avodah Zarah is dealing with the Darabbanans that were answered for various reasons, and they're not really Hashash, most of them. Most of them have to do with Mishum Chasnas, because of intermarriage. So therefore, you see that the general parak, the general discussion, what we're talking about, seems to be focused on Gezeirahs. So there's really lots of indication that we are discussing and we are in the world of Gezeirahs. Okay, very good. So now I understand where they're coming from. So how do we pass it? And as I said, throughout the Dairis, the general Mahalach Alpi Roiv was to follow the Shita that it's a Gezeirah. And there's all these poskim that say, Chach Masadim, I think he's Lashon Chas V'Sholem Chalila, to be Meko like the Radbaz, and say that it's just a Hashash. Why do we call this heter Al Shem Reb Moshe? The heter of Chalav Stam, as we call it, to drink and eat Chalav Akum. Why is it called Reb Moshe? Why do we call it Radbaz? Why don't we call it Pri Chodesh? So the answer is Reb Moshe does something kind of extraordinary. What Reb Moshe does is he says even the Shitas that say it's a Gezeirah, we'll call it the Chassam Sofer. We haven't been given a strong name. We said lots of different names. The Chassam Sofer, it's a Gezeirah. Zot Reb Moshe, even those Shitas would agree with me. Really? How would those Shitas agree with you? If it's a Gezeirah, you're not allowed to have Chalav Akum. You're not allowed to have Chalav Akum. Zot Reb Moshe, there's a concept in the Torah of Yediyah. If you know something's true, the Gezeirah won't be chal. L'chayr Moshe is basing off the Gemara where it says cheese, you're allowed to have cheese. You could do a scientific test. If it turns into cheese, it's not behemoth tameya, assuming there's no issues of milk in the little holes. You'd be allowed to eat that cheese, because that would be Yediyah. The Gezeirah is not chal, but makim Yediyah. Zot Reb Moshe, we know the Goyim didn't mix in behemoth tameya milk. How do you know? Because there's government oversight. And since there's government oversight making sure that the Goyim, that the farm, that the company didn't mix in any milk, that is fine. We know they're not going to do it. There's going to be a fine. They're going to ruin their reputation. We know they're not going to do it. And since we know that they're not going to do it, Mimela, that's a non-sadi, it's a Yediyah. And therefore, that would be allowed, that milk. We know there's no behema tameya. And Reb Moshe brings rayas from the Torah. Reuven chases Shimon into a chorva, into some dead end. And all of a sudden, we finally catch up, and Shimon has a bite mark on his back. Now, Shimon could not have possibly bit himself in the back. And we look around, there's no way out. And there's only Reuven and Shimon in this dead end. The Gemara says that we could be mechayev Reuven to pay Shimon for the bite marks. What do you mean? We don't know that Reuven bit Shimon. There's no edus. Zot Gemara, that's enough. That's a idea. That's a knowledge. It has to be that Reuven bit Shimon. And you see this concept that you could have a idea even though you didn't see it. Another example is that we see a soita go in seclusion with a man. And there was whatever hasra, stira, whatever it was that you, hasra and stira that you need. We see two eidim, not just the classic case of soita where it's one eid. You see two eidim give edus that there was seclusion, there was yichud. We're able to kill that woman and that man. Why? Hein eide yichud, hein eide biyah. The edus of the yichud is enough to know that there was biyah, even though you didn't see the biyah with your own eyes. To kill that woman, you don't need to see the aver of the man going into the woman. You don't need that re'iyah. The eide yichud is enough. And therefore we see once again, there's a concept of yediyah without a pure re'iyah. That you could just know something even though you didn't see it. Another example that Reb Moshe discusses is this is a concept that we see, it's Yedua L'Kol. We see this many times, the non-Sadi concept in Shas, Yedua L'Kol. And if it's known for everybody, that's considered Edus. Zot Reb Moshe, our case is no different. We know the company would not put it in Behema Tameya milk and risk getting fined and ruining their reputation. Is this Reb Moshe Pashid? Is it a Yediyah? So many argue, and almost everybody will argue on Reb Moshe. And they want to say there's a difference between the Yediyah and a presumption. There's a difference between knowing something and presuming something. For example, the case of where Reuven chased Shimon into the chorva, into the dead end. We know there's no other possibility. By the company, by the milk company, the dairy farm, there's a possibility. I agree it's not likely that they mixed in Behema Tameya, but it's possible. Or the Heinei Yichud, Heinei Biyah. Yes, it's true we don't have edus that the man's aver went into the woman's body. However, the Torah is mechayev somebody misa for znus of a eshes. The derech ha'olam is not that you see edus on that actual misa. That's not the derech ha'olam. The derech ha'olam is you see edus on the yichud, and you don't see the actual misa. And that's what the Torah is being mechayev you. So there we'll say hinei yichud, hinei biyah. But that's not just a presumption. And what's something which is obviously known to everybody, yes, that's obviously known to everybody. Over here, it's merely a presumption. A strong presumption, yes. And a further point, which is really based on everything that I said till now. I want to tell you something. There's plenty of people that do stupid things. There's plenty of people that have businesses that are earning millions of dollars a year and do some stupid shtick to earn an extra $50,000 and go to jail for it and ruin their entire business. Was it a stupid thing that they did? Yes. Was it reasonable? No, it wasn't reasonable. But sometimes people do things that aren't reasonable, and that would be the strong kasha against Reb Moshe. Rav Asher Weiss wants to give a suggestion which is a little different than Reb Moshe. And in a way, it deals with some of the shaylas against Reb Moshe. Zakt Rav Asher Weiss, we're not working with the idea, as Reb Moshe says, but with mirsus. Just like when the Jew was sitting outside the farm or the barn or the cattle, whatever it's called, the flock, he didn't actually see the milk go into the bucket. And that's considered Re'iyas Yisrael. Well, so too, when the government provides the mirsus, that also ensures that nothing's getting mixed into no behemoth tamei milk is getting mixed into the bucket. Mali mirsus Yisrael, Mali mirsus FDA, U.S. government, USDA, I guess. Who cares whether the fright is caused by the Jew? Who cares whether the fright is caused by government oversight? Either way, there's fright. And if either way there's fright, what do I care? That's considered to be Chalav Yisroel. Now, the suggestion of Asher Weiss is much more reasonable, so to speak, in the fact to say that the government creates mirsus, creates fright, as opposed to saying that the government creates yediyah, knowledge. And that's for sure true. However, the kasha against Rav Asher Weiss is, l'chayra, we need mirsus Yisrael. We need that Yisrael sees it, not just that there is fright. I understand the svara of Rav Asher Weiss of who cares whether the fright is created by a Jew or whether the fright is created by the Goyish government. However, if the Gemara, the Mishnah clearly states you need the fright to be created by the Jew, it is a leap, an extra step, an assumption from Rav Asher Weiss to assume that government fright would be enough. But I certainly see where it is coming from. So at the end of the day, the Reb Moshe is not particularly pashut. There are, furthermore, to use the heter of Reb Moshe in a place where people aren't really so scared of the government, in, Mexico and South Africa, that would be very difficult, because there isn't even the mirsus, and this isn't the idea that you won't mix something in. I do agree it is a little helpful that non-Jewish milk is more expensive, non-kosher milk, but l'chayra, that's not enough for Reb Moshe. Reb Moshe needs that the government oversight will prove the person won't put his business at risk. An extra couple bucks doesn't, even though it's not an incentive, it doesn't put your business at risk. Another point that I just want to point out is there's a lot of confusion by the concept of powdered milk. There are many people that won't drink Chalav Akum, but would drink powdered milk. Why? So there's two possible reasons for that heter of powdered milk. The most famous is from the Hartzvi, and the Hartzvi says that since you cannot turn behemoth tamei milk into powdered milk, mimela, there's no isser of powdered milk, and powdered milk is okay. Now that seems to be a very, very good proof, because that would be the same thing as the cheese of the Gemara. It's very clear from the Gemara, if there's no way of turning behemoth tamei milk into cheese, and you were able to turn this milk into cheese, then this cheese would be allowed, if it wasn't for any liquid in the holes issues. So therefore, that's a reason to matter powdered milk. However, that very likely was the Metzias, 60, 70 years ago, when Reb Tzipes of Frank lived. I did a quick Google search on Amazon, and I saw that I could buy powdered camel milk on Amazon. There's all sorts of strange people out there that like buying these interesting things like powdered camel milk. So it exists. So to say that you can't turn behemoth milk into powder, it's just not true nowadays. It very likely was true when Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank said it, but nowadays it's certainly not. The other explanation of the heter of powdered milk would be the Gezeirah was only said on liquid. The Gezeirah wasn't said on powdered milk. That is possible. A reason that would make that much more difficult is, how do you get the powdered milk? You used regular milk to turn into powdered milk. You used Chalav Akum to turn into the powdered milk. So it's not so pashut, but it is possible. But the pashut is very difficult to say that. You used your Chalav Akum and turned it into milk, and Chalav Akum, behemoth milk, could turn into powdered milk. It'd be very difficult. I mean, are you going to matter the camel milk? Obviously not. So it's going to be very difficult to say that heter. Maybe there's a little bit to it, but l'maisa, it is very difficult. There's another point that needs to be discussed, which is applicable nowadays, which is there's an issue of some of the cows of the flock becoming a treifa based on a procedure that they perform, and l'chayra in the general flocks, if that procedure is done, those animals become tameh, and the milk from those animals would therefore be tameh, because it's not just milk from a horse which is not kosher, but milk from a treifa will not be kosher as well. And that I plan to discuss in a different shiur. Thank you for listening. And once again, I just want to point out, there is certainly a reason not to rely on the heter of Chalav Yisroel, not to rely on the Reb Moshe. Those who want to rely on Reb Moshe, so l'maisa Reb Moshe said it. There is some debate whether the heter of Reb Moshe will still apply nowadays, because the process is a little bit different, and some claim that the fines are very minimal. To my understanding, the Reb Moshe camp, meaning Reb Moshe's children and grandchildren, still hold the heter of Reb Moshe applies. So if they say the heter of Moshe applies, I guess it does. There definitely is what to debate from a Messiah's standpoint, but they seem to hold that the heter still applies, so I guess I'm not going to argue with them and assume the heter of Reb Moshe still does apply. Therefore, somebody wants to rely on the heter of Moshe could. L'maisa, as everybody knows, Reb Moshe wrote that a Baal Nefesh should be machmir, and it seems from further writings of Reb Moshe, relying on this was certainly an element of a kula, to rely on the chalav of a guy, and as we call Chalav Stam, as Reb Moshe called Chalav the companies. Would Reb Moshe have said it in a situation, definitely if you live in the tri-state area where it's pretty easy to keep Chalav Yisroel, would he have said it? There's strong argument to say that he wouldn't have said it, because a lot of his argument seemingly was based on the fact that it was shas at chak to drink that milk. However, as I pointed out, once again, the Reb Moshe Feinstein camp seems to say that he would have said it. So who am I to argue with them and say that Reb Moshe wouldn't say it? If you'd asked me from Svara, I'm not clear that he would have said it. I think Reb Moshe knew he was saying a chiddush. But once again, if the Reb Moshe camp says that he would have still said this chiddush, then I guess he would have. Somebody in recent times, a friend of mine, his father-in-law asked in recent times, do they need to start keeping Chalav Yisroel? And he said no, they could still rely on the Chalav Stam. I'm assuming they're not lying. There's many reports of such. So I'm not going to come here and say Reb Moshe doesn't apply, but I will come and say it's certainly the din l'chatchila is not to rely on Chalav Stam. And if somebody wants to rely on it, Reb Moshe had broad shoulders, but they should know you're certainly going against Rav Poskim. And thank you for listening. Looking forward to speaking to you next week.